I'm going to come at the thing from a different angle today, I think understandably, because I was never a minor. Well, I was under 18. But I hope there's possibly some crossover in terms of some of the lessons I might try to draw out of this. But unlike Dave, because I think comments know Dave's politics in more general terms, I think he's given us a very useful sort of overview of the strike there. But specifically, Dave's politics and his approach to questions of party. And I am going to argue in the course of this, try to sort of weave in and out of this question about the need for a party. That the miners' strike, to me, amongst a myriad other lessons, far too many to talk about in a brief session like this. One thing that keeps reoccurring is this question of the absence of a viable working class party, and in many ways, I would say, along with the other things I'm going to mention, that was the sort of key to winning or losing the strike. I can understand Dave and other comrades' impatience with the organisations that purport to be working class parties, that purport to be revolutionary parties, i.e. sects that are simply in business when something like the miners' strike comes along to manoeuvre for narrow advantage for themselves. And indeed, again, read in some of the material that Dave has produced in the past, he contrasts very vividly the elan and the creativity that came from the miners' communities and their supporters in the course of the strike to the rather dogmatic, sterile jockeying position of some of the groups. That's fair enough. Nevertheless, this question of party, I think, is key, and I will address it over the coming opening. To agree with Dave, I think the miners' strike was inevitable, and indeed, as he said, if the miners had won a clear-cut victory in 1845, undoubtedly the shape of class relations that followed for the period afterward would be very different, but the ruling class would have needed to come back again. They would have been impelled to have another go. And this is because, as David has said very eloquently, of the position of the miners, I think, in the workers' movement historically and in 1845. And indeed, it's quite hard to impress on comrades, I suppose, younger comrades. I'm talking about now the sort of the central position of the miners in terms of the law of the workers' movement. I find it very hard when you say to compute the notion that there are 2,000 miners left. 2,000 miners left in the country.
I mean,
it is just to me. This is coming from South Wales. I mean,
500,000 used to be.
500,000 in South Wales. I was lying in bed last night and I was thinking, well, what are your earliest memories? Oh yes, watching that stupid pantomime in my little village, ex-mining village, in the Miners' Welfare Hall, or borrowing books from the South Wales Miners' Library, or Miners' Eisteddfods, or whatever. It imbued, all of working class life in particular areas. It characterised and was intrinsic to the fabric of whole swathes of working class communities, and often over romanticised, or fair enough. I don't think there's anything wrong with a bit of romance sometimes, but never whimsy. It's never to do with whimsy. To reiterate what Dave has said, the miners were strategically placed at the centre of the organised working class in this country, and therefore, to deal a defeat in the longer term, the medium term, to the class as a whole, you had to go for the miners. So, if it's a strategic position, a strategic battle looms with the miners, it requires strategic thinking, and that obviously leads me on to the first lesson that I would take away from 1845. There's no question that there was some strategic thinking went on the other side. 72 and 74 defeats inflicted by the miners left a huge imprint on the mindset of the ruling class. And if you remember, in that 1970s period, miners were at the forefront of a generalised wave of militancy. So, undoubtedly, with Thatcher's election in 1979, that was gave a clear signal that the time of consensus politics, the time of beer and sandwiches, etc., as far as that side was concerned, the side of the establishment, that had drawn to a close, and now an era of open confrontation was dawning. The miners' strike, we have to remember as well, was preceded by a number of defeats of important sections of the working class in other sectors. I mean, the print workers with Eddie Shah, wasn't it? Which was the NGA was defeated by this print owner, I think, using the newly enacted anti-trade union laws that had just come onto the statute book, but also car workers, trains, civil servants, etc. So clearly something was building up, something was on its way. But the miners, in terms of defeating them and taking them on, given how their strategic position in the organised working class and how large they loomed, not simply in the mindset of organised labour, but also in the fears of the establishment, that the miners were kind of a different kettle of fish. So I've just noted some of the preparations that went into this war with miners on the side of the government and the state. They beefed up the sort of class war command centre that they had at the centre of the civil service, renamed it the Civil Contingencies Unit, and this constantly had updated files coming to it on 16 key industries, looking at the levels of militancy in it, its vulnerability to strikes, how police and the army could be deployed in the circumstances of a difficult strike. I've mentioned the anti-trade union laws passed already. Then you had the development of a nationally organised, highly paid, that was one of Thatcher's first acts when she came to government, highly paid police force that, Dixon of Dock Green was buried, and police started to look and act like the people we now see on demonstrations, who look like characters of Doctor Who. You see them parading along the street. Something like 50 million tons of coal was stockpiled, which I think is 4 or 5 months of supplies, something like that at that time. And Ian McGregor, butcher of trade union rights in the United States, and also crushed the steelworkers in 1980, he was appointed as the head of NCB, which is a clear message that here comes a war. However, the government was not foolishly belligerent. It was careful in terms of its approach. It attempted to take on the miners at the most advantageous point for them. And that was illustrated in 1981 when plans for up to 40, closer to 40 pits were revealed. There was immediate strike action, with some people just walking out of the pits, other people being picketed out. But within days, something like half the coalfields in the country were on strike, and the government simply backed off. The government climbed down. The plan was withdrawn, and the sort of usual lengthy consultation processes were agreed to go through with Gormley at the time. Was it still Gormley? Dave's article in a recent issue of the Weekly Worker calls this, cites Scottish NUM President Mick McGahey saying that the government did a body swerve at this time, and I think that's correct. But clearly, the trend was obvious, really, and anybody on the left, if they had any sense, could see something large coming. And indeed, in 1983, in August 1983, the Leninist, which was then a would-be quarterly journal. We came out 3 times a year, I think.
My editorship.
Yes. Lucky it came out 3 times a year. Actually wrote this, it's worthwhile quoting. The laws of capitalist economics, the entire mentality of Thatcher and her team, can only lead to the conclusion that an attempt to deliver a strategic defeat on the scale of 1926 is far from impossible. And within months, really, of that August 1983 comment, that attempt at a strategic defeat was started. I think, just to briefly say about the role of the left in that preparatory period. I mean, we were a tiny little organisation. We were a handful of people. I mean, we were a hand and a bit of people. We were 6 people. We could see that coming. Other sections had roots of one sort or another. Other left organisations must have seen it coming, but there was little or no preparatory work, I think, done in that period. What should have been done? I mean, clearly you're not in a war, but it's never too early to prepare for a war. So agitation for the understanding amongst miners and wider sections of the class about the scale and nature of what was coming. And crucially, given the sort of political and social conditions of Britain at the time, that it could not being won in the old traditional type of 1970s run-of-the-mill militant trade union type of way. That something different was required because the ruling class was clearly tooling itself up in a different type of way. That's quite a nice tune, isn't it? Mine just buzzes. And second, flowing from that understanding that something different was coming, to say, well, we need to rediscover some of the methods of the past, and then we need to up our game in terms of the tactics of the class war. The left failed to do that. Okay, that's what I would say about lesson one, the preparation, which was, we now see so much detail of. It's coming out now about the preparation on the other side. On our side, unfortunately, there wasn't the same sort of level of preparedness. Second lesson I would talk about is the need for, in the strike, illustrated very starkly, I think, the independent organisation of the rank and file, or as we put it at the time, the need for a new national minority movement. And then in this context, I think Dave's comments about the ballot are interesting, in that, I think we both recognise that not having a ballot had a cost. We could have taken a banner away from the other side. At certain points in the strike, quite a few points in the strike, sequestration of South Wales funds, etc., a ballot for a national strike could have been won. But it's instructive when you say you go as an official to a meeting of 2,000 men, and their immediate suspicion is the officials are selling us out, which speaks to me of, on one level you could say a healthy distrust of the officials, but it's also unhealthy in the sense of there's a notion of they'll go behind our back, we'll have no control over them, they'll sell us out if we give them, if we go for the ballot, sort of thing. So it speaks of lack of control from below to me to a certain extent. I want to emphasise that when we're talking about this question of need for rank and file control, independent rank and file organisation, we don't have some sort of idiotic workerist punk. Everybody gets elected to a union position is automatically a traitor sort of point. And Scargill is an obvious example of this. I mean, his role in the strike had many weaknesses, but he was intransigent, brave, energetic, and what a contrast between him and the other trade union leaders that we saw. We don't have that type of idiotic rank and filist approach. But precisely you see the weaknesses of that of Scargill as a leader also in that sense. And I got sick of it. You must have had a guts full of it. Going to solidarity meeting after solidarity meeting, conference after conference, and then people standing up and saying the miners' strike is a fight for all workers. So and you'd ask them, so how come the miners are fighting alone? All right? How come they're by themselves, despite the pledges of solidarity, despite the fine words from other trade union leaders? Why are they by themselves? Right? So the battle to get other trade unions to deliver anything more than hot air rhetoric and hot air solidarity, that would have meant reaching over their heads, speaking over their heads to the rank and file directly, calling on them to Jesus. Oh, Jesus. I've just cleared my throat. Speaking over the heads of other trade union leaders, direct to the rank and file, organising them if necessary against their own trade union leaders in order to deliver effective trade union solidarity, in order to stand alongside the miners. And that was something that Scargill, given his position as a trade union bureaucrat with a particular set of politics, I want to emphasise this is a political thing at the end of the day, not the fact that he's in a particular layer in the workers' movement, was incapable of doing. And I want to emphasise something about the potential of that. Dave has already alluded to this. Okay, so Scargill was not able to mobilise or send miners out to become political agitators to mobilise other sections of the workers' movement, sort of rank and file base up. Fair enough, but would they have met a ready response? Well, I think that Dave has already mentioned the dockers were on strike twice, which produced quite a panic actually at the time. I remember the British newspapers, British bourgeois newspapers, shitting themselves about this very important second front opening up. The same laws that were deployed against the miners were being used against workers in British Leyland car industry. There was unrest on the trains. There are 3 million unemployed. There was huge combustible material in society in general. And here's another poll for you. The Sunday Times in late 1984 had a poll and indicated that 25% of workers were prepared to take solidarity action with the miners. All right? Now, I mean, that's not a bad base to start from, to make them the pacemakers for the rest of the class, to arm them with the arguments to go out and say, well, let's make it 60%, 70%, let's make it a general strike, i.e. objectively what was necessary. But these people weren't linked up, they weren't being given these arguments, and that is a product of poison of sectionalism. Indeed, the Dockers leaders, I think, at one point declared our dispute has got nothing to do with the miners, and in order to protect the dock labour scheme, which was the thing they were fighting for, terms, conditions, that sort of thing. Hope I'm not boring you. Team G members actually ended up, despite themselves, moving scab coal into Britain during the strike. This flows from the fact that the dominant politics remained that of the trade union bureaucracy, I think, in the strike, and that fosters sectionalism. It fosters an identification with a particular sector, the viability of your own particular industry. That's where I would disagree with Dave and the plan for coal, etc. I think that was a reflection of that within the miners as well. We can have a discussion about it when we come to the more general question and answer thing. Anyway, so let's contrast that fragmentation with what they were doing on their side. Dave quotes from a book which was. It's interesting, and it really releases new material. The book Dave reviewed in the Weekly Worker in July, Marching to the Fault Line by Francis Beckett and Henk. And David says this, and then goes on to quote the book. One thing this book does nail to the floor is any notion that the government was not involved in the strike. Quote, Peter Walker chaired a daily meeting to coordinate action during the strike with the senior officials from the Home Office, Employment, Transport, the National Coal Board, and the Central Electricity Generating Board. Twice weekly on Mondays and Wednesdays, Thatcher herself chaired the MISC 101, ominously named, the ministerial group on coal. Its purpose was to exchange information, give a ministerial steer to the media, and to work out policy. That's the level of coordination on their side. Right? And on our side, look, the level of disruption, the level of idiotic sort of bureaucratism. Okay. Yeah. So, and this accounted for. This was our approach in that sense. Look, we need generalised strike action in solidarity with the miners. This is an attack on all workers. We place demands on our leaders. It's correct to place demands on our leaders. We're not idiot anti-trade union leaders because they happen to be trade union leaders. However, we have to establish, through our own actions from below, centres of authority with sufficient clout in our class so that if our leaders do not move, we're able to have the pull to bring out workers alongside the miners. And so, that's summed up in that headline that we fairly consistently push toward the strike, with or without the TUC general strike. And concretely, I don't have time to really go into it, but we look to the miner support committees, things that were uniting the best militants in the area in both practical solidarity for the strike. Collecting big beans and that sort of thing was very important. But also, by the end, certainly under the influence of us in some places, looking beyond simple relief and looking towards organising solidarity action. They had potential, in other words, for councils of action. The rest of the left, I'll mention the SWP purely in relation to this because I think they were the most despicable. For 6 months, they denounced the miner support committees for being only good to collect sort of woolly jumpers and baked beans. All right? Then, when they anticipated narrow sector advantage for themselves, they joined the miner support committees in order to advocate that they restrict their activities to collecting woolly jumpers and baked beans. Any attempt to go beyond that, any talk of coordinating action, they scotched, they rubbished. They said, no, this is madness. All right, let's speak up a bit.
Is it worthwhile mentioning, is it Chris Harman or?
I was going to come to that. No, that's right. No, quite right. Okay.
Just that you're on the SWP.
Last lesson I'll mention, question of the state. I've mentioned plan for coal, etc. Recently we've caused some controversy with this question of workers' militias and making propaganda for that idea at a time when, silly us, there isn't a revolutionary situation. I fancy doing that. During the strike, we raised this question of workers' defence corps. The SWP at the time, for example, was saying, well, as we're against a general strike, how can you possibly raise the question of workers' militias under these circumstances? Luckily, not that many miners presumably were reading Socialist Worker, because sections of them went out and organised their own hit squads, their own form of embryonic miners' support miners' militias. Again, well ahead of the left in that sense. And this raises this question of what we've been talking about yesterday, day before, in relation to the Soviet Union, early Soviet Union, the question of workers' power. And I think the miners showed quite a degree of less squeamishness when they understood that they were in a class battle for their communities, for their jobs, for their children, and maybe some leftists display sometimes, in that these simply weren't for polite picketing of polite sort of stewarding of picket lines, etc. These went out and beat up scabs. These went out and instituted terror against people who were breaking the strike, and good. Right? That was a good thing. We drew a parallel with 1926 and particular material that we stumbled across in Methil Fife, which was great material. Where the police had initially attacked the picket line.
That's what I'm saying, where it is?
Methil Fife.
Oh, sorry, Scotland.
Scotland,
yeah,
sorry, yeah. 1926 general strike. The police had initially attacked the picket line. There had been a general call from the Trades Council, and the Workers' Defence Corps swelled to 700 people, and the Trades Council secretary led them through the town on a big fucking white horse. And there's a sort of laconic comment in the strike bulletin from the time: this was the last time the police interfered. So understandably again. So we drew on those lessons from 1926 to try and explain what we were talking about to the miners, and it was an important argument, and it was not an argument that fell on stony ground. And as I said, sections of the miners were starting to do it themselves. Again, to contrast with the dull sort of approach of the SWP, their simple operative slogan for counteracting police violence was that miners are allowed to fight back and step up the picketing, right? i.e. double numbers. And they cited Salty Gate and the confrontations of the 1970s when the police were able to be swamped, which spoke of the police's lack of organisation from the 1970s, which was precisely what they didn't have now. They'd learned the lesson and stepped up. They upped their game. All right? The SWP kept repeating that trade unionist formula from the past. Right about there. All right. Well, in the conclusion, I know we'll mention 1927. We were a tiny organisation. I'm quite proud of what we did during the strike. We sort of not to gain sustenance from it in the same way that sects attempted to do. We did grow during the strike, but we attempted to throw ourselves into it and actually put ourselves at the service of this movement. It was a sort of living example of precisely what we were talking about when we spoke in terms of inner party struggles for reforging the Communist Party, i.e. let's not take what's in the Communist Party at the moment, which is shit, reform is shit, and just nonsense. But let's bring forces from outside, from sort of the molten heat of large class battles. This helps us reforge the Communist Party. We had limited success with ones and twos in terms of the miners, but it showed us the validity of that type of strategy. Interestingly, it destroyed other organisations. It destroyed the Workers' Revolutionary Party, blew them apart. It ended the pretensions of the Revolutionary Communist Party. I think one headline did that when they all went to the Yorkshire once, and they headlined it, RCP hits the pits. And everybody said, yeah, that's right. And it fatally punctured the pretensions of sections of the Communist Party to being anything to do really with militant struggle. Miners needed a Communist Party, not a sect, but a section of the class, a part of the class itself, with a unity of purpose, organisation, tactical orientation, amongst the advanced layer, which cut across cut across different sections of industry and reached into every nook and cranny of society. That's fundamentally what I think we would argue that they needed. I will mention here, I'm going to have to skip a bit where it talks about it, but I will mention the sort of dismal defeatism of sections of the left that the RCP have mentioned, but the SWP as well. People present themselves as sort of strike chasers and almost uncritical sort of banner wavers for picket lines, etc. David's right, the strike could have won. Right? There were moments when the establishment looked very, very shaky. They admitted themselves now in memoirs, the papers are being released, etc. Right? The SWP didn't say it explicitly until the very end, but the SWP regarded the strike as doomed from the start. It came in a period when they regarded the class struggle as being in the downturn. And before the strike had ended, Chris Harman of the SWP wrote, "We are not living in 1926, we are living in 1925. Sorry, 1925, living in post 1927, post the general strike, i.e. we are defeated already, before the miners' strike."
This is an extreme example of what we in the SWP
called the downturn. Yeah, exactly.
Expression.
A huge strike, world historic significance, all right, and for the SWP, because it doesn't fit into their particular set of theses, perspectives adopted at their last conference, etc., because they haven't gained that much advantage of it, it's not really that much to write home about. I suppose I'll kind of finish there, but the last thing I suppose I will say is, looking back over the copies of the Leninist has been a bit of a joy for me, because I'm a bit like that. And in a strike like this,
what's sad?
Yeah, cheeky bastard. In a strike like this, along with bitterness at when it loses, bitterness at the betrayals of sections of the workers' movement, bitterness with the sort of attacks and assaults from the bosses that come subsequent to the defeat. There's also joy in things like this, and there were joyous moments in this strike. I think David's captured it sometime, is it A Year Out of Our Lives? It's that's a very good book. I recommend that also. I mean, two incidents in particular I would mention, which is a lesson that class struggle shouldn't simply be grim all the time, even when you're on the losing side. There are great moments. Stuart King in this school talked about sort of rather simple-minded workers just learning stuff by doing stuff, and then we come along and say, "Did you know what you just did?" Let me tell you, let me draw you this little picture here. It's not too long, I think you can read that.
Workers' power.
I know you need to get myself, Jim Moody, and another comrade, who's long since gone, back to the class that spawned her.
Exactly. Businesswoman of the Year.
Businesswoman of the Year. We're living in a tent in Nottinghamshire, getting up in the middle of the night and listening to the police broadcasts, and then rushing along to the picket lines to try and rapidly give out propaganda and to speak to people and that sort of thing. We'd gone well equipped. We had a tent, no rope. So we unravelled some taffeta sort of thing, and we survived. We heard over the radio the sequestration of the South Wales area NUM's funds, and we drove up down to South Wales. We got there with the only lefties there. The militant arrived later from their summer camp. The only lefties there. We had copies of the Leninist. We just gave the fuck.
Fantastic headlines by me.
Fantastic headlines by Johnny. Is, as you know, pithy.
Liquidation.
Yes, pithy, snappy, middle names. Myopic liquidationism was one, which militants took the piss out of us for about 20 years afterwards. But the greatest sight I saw in the strike, along so many great sights you saw, was a miner sitting down, actually, turning in the Leninist and going to the supplement and starting to read about World War III, the danger of it, and how to avoid it. All right, and I came back half an hour and I was still reading it. All right, a 5,000, 6,000 word supplement. I just thought, well, that's Stuart King. Where are you? Look. And also, lastly, very briefly, I mean, I didn't have time to talk about the women's movement and that sort of thing, and the way the miners, the whole question of the press, like gays, etc., came around the miners and support and how attitudes changed, etc. But we did some very good interviews with some of the women. I'll read out, we were organised into Women Against Pit Closures movement. I'll read out just a section of it, and my favourite line is at the end. We asked, has there been a change in the rule, a change in attitude from the men? And Kay Sutcliffe, didn't she have a rather unpleasant husband? That's Peter Sutcliffe, isn't it? That was Kay Sutcliffe, wasn't it? Anyway, yes, definitely. I think when we first started our activities in the strike, the men were all for it. They didn't realise we meant what we were doing. And Mary Collins, I don't think they realised how far we could go. Kay Sutcliffe, I don't think they realised we had such organising qualities, really. And I think they're proud of us and glad we've done it. Margaret Densham, I tell you what it's done for me. Before the strike, I didn't know the meaning of left and right. I know I'm definitely bloody left now. I wasn't politically minded, you see. They'll find out which way I am now. Mary Collins, I think in a way Thatcher mobilised a lot of women against her when she decided that they were going to cut the social benefit for strikers and their families. She thought that the women would say to the men, please go back to work, we're desperate. And then she found out that people were not going to do that, and because the kids were starving, we had to go out on the streets and organise collections. But after that we realised we had to get out to the meetings and speak and let people know exactly what was happening in the strike to counteract the bad press. This is it. Margaret Densham. We don't watch Crossroads now. We watch World in Action, Panorama, you name it. We've forgotten all about Crossroads now.
The trouble with the far left is there were so many of them, self-declared Moses, that we got buried in 10 Commandments by people coming to tell us what to do, where to go, and they hadn't got a clue what was going on. I remember the group that published the paper, The Next Step, they didn't even know what the last step was, never mind what the next step was. You know, and these people were telling us what to do. The workers' power were absolutely pains up the bloody arse. They didn't understand what we were doing. I actually reread one of the papers the other day from 1984, where they said, you know, they've sent all these pickets into Nottingham, dispersed them instead of going to Orgreave. Well, that was the point. The scabs were in Nottingham. We had to close down the Nottingham coalfield. We didn't want to one-off General Custer stand at Orgreave, you know, with Arthur leading the 7th Cavalry, you know. We needed to bring the scabs out. We needed to stop the coal being produced in Nottingham. But the workers' power thought it was a diversion, and they thought Jack Taylor was directing the pickets away from the militant action. Well, if there was anybody directing them away, it was me, because we supported Pickett there. We also wanted to go to Orgreave, not a lot, but go there now and again. But to actually turn up every day, twice a day, all you needed was to blow a bloody whistle and wave the flag and say, right, and we fought each other, you know, got battered to bloody hell. Then I went away and had a pint at the pub, and then come back and did it again in the afternoon. And meantime, the coal was pouring out of bloody Nottingham. I mean, it was strategically bollocks going to Orgreave, but once we were committed to Orgreave, we had to go try and make Orgreave work. And I mean, it is true that we did actually stop the plant. A terrific cost in terms of injuries. We did stop the plant, and the cops admitted that they couldn't sustain that, but the truth was, neither could we. We couldn't sustain it, you know. So that's just a party thing. And the rank and file control thing, you know, you have to realise that the miners come from a tradition of syndicalism and of not trusting leaders. I mean, although we've had inspired leaders like Arthur Cook and Arthur Scarborough during the strike, people still never trusted to this extent. The strike couldn't have happened if we'd been a centralised union. It could only happen because it was a decentralised union. Each constituent body of the miners' union was a separately constituted union. So the Yorkshire area is a separate union. We were more of a confederation than a federation, than a national union. Within that structure, the branches all have autonomy, have their own funds. Some branches are registered as separate unions. So on their own right, are certificated as a union, branches. So the branches are autonomous from the area. Then within the branch, you have an official branch committee, which is fine, and branch officials. But during a strike, they elect a strike committee from the rank and file. Because in case the strike committee in case the branch committee isn't up to conducting a strike, the kind of material and metal that you need to run a strike isn't the same as the day-by-day people. So you might have strike coordinators, not the branch officials, elected from the floor. But then we had an area strike coordinating committee of the officials but we didn't take any notice of it. So we had unofficial panels of branches where we held our own coordinating meetings and elected our own strike committee. And then we had a area coordinating committee, but then we had unofficial coordinating committees. You know, and the national office could never direct the pickets because they didn't have any pickets. Only coalfields had pickets. And so there's huge arguments about it. So there was massive rank and file control in terms of who did what. And it was really only until Arthur asserted this, his idea of making Orgreave saltly and announced that we should all go to Orgreave that we actually lost control of the picketing direction and the strategy. Plus the fact, of course, that the coal board's policy was to open up a second front. Part of the second front was Orgreave. The other second front was to make sure they could put a scab in every pit, which would throw all the pickets back into their own backyard and take us out of the coalfield. Now, South Wales was the only area where there was pits where there were no scabs at all. It didn't succeed in South Wales. But everywhere else, we had it, even in the most militant areas. I mean, Doncaster was actually stronger than Wales in terms of numbers on strike, but we had a scab in every pit, and it threw people back. So this was a deliberate policy. The question of dispensations is an interesting one because I'm not decided about that. The truth was we needed the steel industry. I say we, as miners, we supplied coal to the steel industry, coke, to produce steel. And the deal we'd made for coke ovens that produced coke and for steelworks was that we would supply them with enough fuel to keep the furnaces alive. Because if you let the furnace close, it's gone, and the plant's gone, and we've lost that side. The thing was that the deal was that they didn't produce steel. You run a throughput dummy thing of a steel thing, but you don't make anything at the end of it. So the last steel arches were supplied to Nottingham in April. That was what they had on board. There was no more supplies going into the scab coalfields from the steelworks. And the chorus was losing £1 million a week from the dispensation. Now, Arthur never agreed with the dispensations. He thought, fuck them. And unfortunately, Arthur took control of that question and stopped the dispensation to the steelworks, which sounds very fiery, but unfortunately it opened up another front for us, which led to Orgreave, because they went straight to Orgreave to get the coke. It took all of our pickets, at one point 20,000 pickets fighting in the field at Orgreave. And it meant that we had another area. It's what caused the scabs at Immingham, what sparked the whole of that. In my view, we could have done without it at that time. And it wasn't costing us anything. You know, it kept them sweet and kept it working. In terms of the coke, you see, the steelworkers had the argument that but you're letting the coke works continue. The deal with the coke works was we got the coke. So we supplied it to our pensioners, and we supplied it to hospitals, and we supplied it to schools. But we were the only people who directed where it went. So any scab lorries weren't allowed to deliver that fuel, so they got struck off the list. So it kept some of the drivers on side as well, that we give dispensations, and anybody who was going to work to mine the coal to give to the coke only got the same money as picket money. So they got £1 a day for working in the pit all day to supply coal to pensioners or whatever. And it was a way of trying to control the situation, you know. It was amiss of me not to mention the women's support group, because what we have to remember is this: 110,000 miners didn't picket. 110,000 didn't picket, but they stayed on strike. The vast majority of them stayed on strike for 12 months, but they never went near a picket line. And if it wasn't for the fact that the women's movement fed, clothed and looked after those people, the strike could never have happened. So that whole welfare operation of getting food, of getting solidarity aid, and of keeping people fed and alive kept the strike going. And people didn't want to go on the picket line, they didn't want to get involved with that. My mate used to call all that medieval stuff and battling them out with the cops. They didn't want to do that, but they weren't going to scab either. And you know, I mean, at the end of the day, those people held the line for 12 months, just as much as the people on the picket lines did. And it wasn't really until McGregor managed to put a scab in every pit that the whole paraphernalia of police occupation and riding up and down streets and battering people came home to visit everybody. Before that, in the first 6 months of the strike. It was only if you went on a flying picket that you got that thing. There's no doubt about it that had we had a coordinated body, such as a genuine Communist Party, in the way that we had in 1974. I mean, 1974, I picketed the same places as I did in 1984. 1974, you could sit all day outside the steelworks and you'd never see a lorry. Because if a lorry ever did come, it would never get unloaded. Because we had total solidarity, you know. And the only difference between 74 and 84 was they didn't scab. And the other unions supported us. And I have to say this, man. By April, we had established, the Transport and General Workers Union under Ron Todd had established a national coordinating committee at Transport House. And the steel workers were on it, the dockers were on it, the miners were on it, the railway workers were on it, ASLEF and RMT, National Union of Seamen was on it, and GMB was on it. To regulate and carry out the pledge that had made us that they wouldn't move coal or scab fuel, and that was a joint note that was issued by all of those unions, including ISTC. So, you know, there was efforts to go down to those lines. Now, when it disintegrated, I don't know, but they were holding meetings up until June. And I have to say, you know, that we got total solidarity from the National Union of Seamen and from the rail workers. I mean, down at Immingham, we hung a little flag over the bridge saying, you know, NUM picket line. And the first freight coal lorry coming out of the Immingham terminal stopped, and it stayed on the line for 12 months. And nobody could go one way or the other past it, and that's why they had to start this huge lorry service, you know, something like 5,000 lorries a day to replace that shipment of coal.
I missed a part of your question, but if you were asking in terms of the strike and in terms of attitude to the class struggle, were the tankies better in general than the Eurocommunists? Yes, because in that sense they were of the left of the party. They identified in some way, all right, through the prism of Stalinism, with working class struggles, with militancy. We didn't make ourselves very popular by. Here's one of our articles on Polish coal. We headlined others as why does Jaruzelski scab? So we thought it was even within the parameters of our politics in those days, we thought it was a disgrace, and unfortunately a number of comrades from that background basically make the excuses about fulfilling contracts, etc. I have to say, somebody like Jack Collins, Kent area NUM leader, although he was of that tankies persuasion, he basically called for Poland to be thrown out of various international bodies and this, that, whatever. So he was quite clear on that question.
You wrote his article.
He did sign that. He did agree. No, that was an interview. Actually, he said that. I will do this very quickly. I think the question of scabs is an interesting one, and partially I think Dave contradicts himself to a point. Me? Did I? Absolutely. You know, scabbing is treachery, etc. But the notion of once a scab, always a scab creates huge problems for us, probably in terms of the workers' movement. We have to have a variety of different tactics in order to engage with scabs under some circumstances, beat the living shit out of them under other circumstances, by a range of tactics. I think it's a correct tactic. You know, obviously that concrete circumstances dictated in particular areas, you left them in, and in other circumstances, you got them in the shower and hit them. You know, those are tactics. And precisely the example you use of Selby, where the majority was scabbing at one point and then they were out on a strike. And another, I know it's heartfelt when you say once a scab, always a scab, but clearly not in that sense. This is a long argument about the nature of work and struggles to come and this, that, and whatever. I think the question is one of control, and you seem to be implying that the nature of work has changed to such an extent that people will not conduct hard, long, vicious, industrial struggles. Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think the key question is one of control, and that's true in Woolworths, as it was in the mines in that sense. The control of your own life, control over the things that you're producing, control over your time when you're at work, etc. Under those circumstances, people can identify fully with their work, even though you and I might find it pretty tedious or pretty unpleasant or pretty horrible to do. We were speaking before the meeting started, and Dave tells me that he loved going down the mine. He loved it. He loved the job. Yeah?
Not that was 4 in the morning.
No, fair enough. If he had control, he would have put himself on a different shift. he loved the work, all right? When I was in South Wales, I was kind of offered a job down the fucking mine, and I ran like hell to college in London rather than do it, all right? So it's a question of control, fundamentally, I think, about this question. But I'm not such a massive subject I'm really touching on.
Yeah, I think coming back and just on that, the thing about pit work is it's not alienating work. It's not like working on a bench pulling a handle on it. It's more like George Orwell described it as climbing a small mountain every day. And people climb mountains because they enjoy climbing mountains, while at the same time you can be terrified climbing a bloody mountain, but still do it. And mining's a bit like that. And the reason why we fought so hard was for 2 reasons. One, because the work's less alienating, but 2, because of the power of the influence of workers' control in the industry. We controlled our own work. We always resisted supervision. If anybody, like a deputy or whoever came near you, you stopped work. And if the management came, you stopped work. Now they knew that because they were there, production would stop. They didn't come. Or if they did, they'd sail straight on through. Because the idea was, that we ran our own work. Nobody could tell you what to do, because if anything went wrong, they'd carry the can anyway. So we did that ourselves. And every day is different. Every day you direct your own job, and you're in struggle with the earth, etc. And it's stimulating. I mean, up at 4 in the morning, it's not good. Working in water is not good. Working in a small seam is not good. But at the end of the day, it's your own. You've got control of your own life. But it was also the fact that the union was so powerful that we could intervene in society. So at the end, in the final analysis, it wasn't whether some far-off field in Barnsley would have a pit head in it or not that we were fighting for. It was our ability to fight. It was our ability to intervene in society, to challenge society, to pose an alternative vision of society that we lost. And the thing that is most devastating now when you go to pit communities isn't the loss of the headgear or the pit, it's the loss of that faith and that vision when miners have been poor before, miners have been defeated nearly always, except in up to 1972 and 74, and some minor disputes, small disputes. But we've always come back, and we've always had the strength to come back, and people have always believed that we could change things, and we could. Now that's gone. And now we've got disillusionment, etc. I mean, not total, because Durham Miners' Gala this year had 90,000 people at it. 90,000 people is about the figures that we were getting in the 1960s. And like tens of thousands of people sat in the field listening to speakers, trade union speakers, left speakers, people talking about changing society. And it's the biggest demonstration in Europe. And the last pit closed in 1994. So in a sense, it's not a total thing, but that's why. The reason why they launched this to close the pits was precisely to get rid of that politicised workforce, to get rid of the industrial proletariat. They needed to get rid of it, to make us a service industry, so that all the work would be done in the third world, where they don't have unions, where you can grind people down into poverty, where you can kill them en masse, as is happening in the Chinese coal mines right now. So I mean, that's why they did it. That's why they've decimated European industry, in my view. It wasn't to do with economics, purely economics. It was to do with social control. The industrial working class represented a challenge, and they needed to smash that challenge by, in the end, committing a kind of industrial genocide and getting rid of us altogether. Which is why I have so many arguments with the climate camp people, but that's another story. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to speak here, by the way. It's always a privilege, and thanks very much.